let's start with, I think, based on the conversation we just had, let's start with what do you see as the biggest challenge we have right now to creating an engaging experience for employees at work, right? Something that, regardless of how we define engagement, something that feels good to the employee that allows them to be their best at work. What's our biggest challenge we're facing right now?
It's such a good question, and where my head goes is a lack of self-awareness.
Across the board?
So there's research that shows that 90% of people think they're self-aware, but 10% are rated as self-aware. So in terms of top driver of engagement is strengths utilization. When, as an executive coach or somebody who measures engagement, when we ask people what their strengths are, they often wildly underestimate them.
Sure.
And so that part, and then leaders having a sense in their head of how they're supposed to be and trying to be that thing, but not necessarily understanding how people are actually experiencing them. And so from an engagement perspective, the more you can be at your best more often in the context of the relationship, you're going to be a more effective boss, you're going to be a more effective employee.
Right.
So trying to actually start at home.
Yeah. So is that a new problem? Because that seems to me like something that we could have been maybe having the same conversation 2 decades ago. Is it new? Is it different? Is it getting worse, better?
It's interesting because I'm actually surprised I said it because I started measuring employee engagement in 1997. And so at that time, the way that we collapsed data, right, was favorable scores.
Right.
Right?
Still happens today.
And if you're doing that, stop doing that.
Right.
Because it basically on a 1 to 5 scale, your 1s and 2s detract value, your 3s and 4s basically cover their own costs, and your 5s, top box scores, are producing wildly better results. And so when we started to understand that and unpack the people who were there, right, sort of a positive psychology outlier perspective, you begin to see that what drives that is their own growth mindset, their own self-management skill, their own awareness, and then their relationship with their boss in the context of an organization that has a healthy culture. So I think it's probably been around for a while, but it gets clearer and clearer the more you look at the thing that you want and figure out the people who have it, what do they do that other people don't do? And they leverage strengths better, they relate better, they have higher emotional intelligence.
So how do we, because this feels like a challenge that we've had. I mean, I remember, 15 or 20 years ago in HR, or even before that, just as someone interested in personal development, self-awareness was such a foundational thing, and it's hard work to do this work. How do we start making progress on that? If that's our foundational issue, how do you advise clients, or how organizationally do we start moving the needle?
So I think about it in terms of, for me, engagement is working really hard to achieve a result and possibly enjoying it, at least retrospectively, right? It's sort of very close to the concept of flow. And so if you want people to get there more often, you're going to do it by really getting good at strength-based stuff.
Okay.
Right? So, and you can get at the underbelly of a leader by looking at strengths typically, like where do you go too far, you hit the declining marginal utility thing. But I worked with a leader he was a surgeon up in Boston, down the street from Harvard, and he said, Kath, we go to the school and we listen to lectures about leadership and we think they're talking about somebody else. Right? And so for me, engagement happens one person at a time, and inside of a culture where people are doing meaningful work and those kinds of things, but a lot of it is really accounted for by how I choose to show up and how I choose to relate to my work and how my boss and I work together. And that's pretty personal, and it's emotional, relational.
Okay, different question, and if with your background in leadership and coaching, I'd be interested to hear what you think on this. But so we've been asking, as we've been talking to people, is there? I have a love-hate relationship with management practice. So is there a management practice that you kind of love to hate that you wish would go extinct in 2019? If there was some management practice or some management approach or management mindset that you'd love to see gone forever, what would it be?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I think I just was involved in a conversation about the real-time feedback apps. All right. I don't like mean feedback. I think 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and a lot of places now still, if I were doing a development plan for you, they would say, what are your strengths? What are your development areas? And how do I close the gaps?
Right.
And it's just kind of, am I allowed to say stupid?
Yes.
It's kind of stupid because if you think about it from an investment standpoint, if you are a human capital asset and we acquire you, my job as your boss is to figure out where your potential is and where your risks are, and to use your assets to drive through your risks. So if you just focus on gaps and closing gaps, people get defensive. They get, they begin to feel like they need to be more of who they are, and then managers start being afraid of performance conversations. And it's like, really? The idea is help people understand who they are in the context of the team that they're in, and a lot of times people need help with that. Right? How do you bring your strengths in a way that's actually useful? How do you add value in a team, without doing too much? Or that's a conversation.
Yeah.
That is a series of calibrations.
Yeah.
Do more of this, do less of that. And so I have to work twice as hard for positive feedback on somebody.
Right.
As critical feedback.
Sure.
Maybe 3 times as hard
Right.
to get a decent amount of data.
Right.
So I would like the over focus on negative feedback to go away.
Got it.
And I would like it to be asked in more of a value-based way.
One of the things I'm going to take away from this conversation is mean feedback. I love that as a frame. Like, that's such a great way of describing it that I've never heard that word used specifically that way, but that's such a great way to capture it, because we get so wrapped up in, what do you call it? It's like feedback versus critical feedback versus constructive feedback versus whatever. I think mean sort of captures the essence of what we want to get out of the system.
And to me, do you know Danny Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow? Right. So I've read that book a couple times, and it's like I probably, if I were left on a desert island, that would be the book I wanted.
Right.
And previously it would have been the Bible, right? But it's like, okay, no, I'm taking Danny Kahneman with me.
Right. That's pretty serious.
Right.
That's
but
high praise.
It is partly because our brains go to judgment so fast,
right.
And to slow down and say, like, what is the thing that the person is doing? And especially from a diversity and inclusion perspective, I have learned over the years. I interviewed a guy, and we'll say his name is Mike Johnson, right? So I go through a whole interview process on this guy before I meet him, and people are telling me what a phenomenal communicator he is, and how he just is so great. And then I meet him, and he's like a 6'2", beautiful black man who went to Harvard and MIT, and I was like, damn, I need to go back and do all the interviews again.
Right.
But these people's brains were so surprised by how great he was that their judgment was super positive.
Right.
And they didn't actually give me anything that was valuable.
Got it.
So I went back and did them all again.
Right.
And I think that judge versus observe thing, like really watch what is the thing that is happening that is leading your brain to a conclusion.
Right.
And is it yours, or is it about you, or is it about them?
Yeah. That's incredibly powerful. So last question I'll ask is, if you, as our audience might be HR professionals or managers, leaders, do you have is there something that you have kind of as a go-to piece of advice or strategy if you're, if you wanted to provide them with sort of a tip or a place to start or something to think of if they want to improve the work experience for employees?
There's a friend and mentor of mine is a guy named Tal Ben Shahar, and his phrase is permission to be human, right? So giving people permission to be amazing and permission to be human requires different things of how we teach leaders. So like the idea of own it, drive hard, do all of those things, but also listen like you're wrong, right? Be willing to pivot, and when you're wrong, the faster you can figure out you're wrong. That's we have to teach people how to do that. Or if I make a mistake and we work together and you hold it against me for the rest of my life, right? It's like we need to teach people that forgiveness is a leadership skill. We need to teach them that when they get feedback, it's like, yeah, I acknowledge I did say that, and I can see how you would see it that way. But to basically unwire the defensiveness that we've put in people, and it's like own it and pivot. It's like drive with passion, but also be compassionate, and it's that that sense of like, yes, I know you work really hard, and you work so hard you don't sleep, and you need to go home and get some rest.
Right.
So that people can cognitively, emotionally, and physically understand their extraordinary capacity and their limitations. And I think we've done a good job on the capacity side, and not such a good job on the how do you own the real human limitations that you have. And I think that's probably where we're going to go. That's important work. That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Nice to meet you. Yeah, nice to meet you.